So this morning is a question and response, and I always feel like it's important to say at the opening of these Sundays, rather than a Dharma talk, is a time for questions. Notice it don't say question and answer, it say question and response. That's on purpose, right? So the purpose of a question is not really to get an answer. The purpose of a question is to get a response, and then the answer is something that we find out with our lives. Right? We live out answers. We also live out responses. But the idea isn't just to kind of find the hole and see if I can plug it, right? But is to try to expand our understanding, our inquiry into the Buddha Dharma, into life, into what is it to try to do the best we can. So we've had a busy October preparing for Segaki, which was the festival that happened last Sunday. Many of you were there, and that's always very energetic, a lot going on, so there might be something that got kicked up by that, or anything else, or there's been some other things going on this past week. I remember what they were. But really anything's fair game. My job in the teaching seat is to respond authentically, and particularly as a representative of a particular lineage and of a teaching lineage within the Buddha Dharma. And so that's my work. Your work is just to kind of have the insight to see where your questions really are, and then the guts to share them with everyone, not just me.
Ojo-san, what I've been contemplating is, we've talked a lot. You've talked about relinquishment, and as my years minimize, so I think about that a lot, and I think about it in relation to what I have cared about so deeply. And of course some of that's been upset. But it isn't only that area of my life. It's the people, the dogs, everything. And so I can feel that detachment, and I feel it more strongly. And I then, particularly this week, I get concerned. At what point does that detachment, does that relinquishment become nihilism? Would it become, all right, then I just, to hell with it.
Yeah.
Right? So that has been a little concerning to me.
Yeah.
And it's not like absolutely over here or absolutely over there.
Yeah.
So.
One thing to watch for in practice in general, particularly as it pertains to relinquishment, is does relinquishment bring us closer to what is present, or does it feel like it is creating a barrier between ourselves and the world? And that's a place that we can really watch for. Now, ideally, the things that we love in our life, they will change, and they will also disappear. They will also go wrong. There'll be all kinds of things that happen. But the things that we really care for, the ultimate purpose for caring for them is that they will show us a way through the chaos of power and domination to a field of openness, respect, love. And every one of those relationships, every one of those things we care about, that's its deeper purpose. The relationship itself will change. There'll be some times that are very hot, passionate, or like very involved, making things happen, raising kids, doing all those kinds of things. And then there will come a time that it's time to say goodbye. But in that goodbye, it's not going cold. That's what we should watch for. If the goodbye is going cold, it's like we're protecting ourselves from the deeper truth. And the deeper truth that things really are settled, calm, available, true, is so challenging to our normal psyche that we really have to, it's a tumultuous journey to find those things you care about and let them lead you through to that open field. So, no, that's where I'd point you. I wrote this morning, I tried to change what's on the gate about once a month, and I've been thinking the past couple of weeks to change it, and I thought, oh wow, after the election, I really have to change it. And so what I wrote this morning is a capping phrase, was a kind of traditional Zen capping phrase. It says, let me see if I can remember what I wrote. I didn't write it. Some ancestor hundreds of years wrote it, and I just translated it into English and then put it on. Not entering the waves deeply, fighting to see the one who plays in the tides. So sometimes it's one translation I read of it was like, if you don't enter into the waves deeply, how will you see the one who frolics in the tides? And I think that's pretty good, but it's a little bit too pressurized, right? I think actually it's better just to see the dynamic, right, rather than to say, why aren't you entering deeply into the waves? No finger wagging here. It's just actually saying when we don't enter deeply into the waves, and in the Chinese it's sort of like the breaking or the cascading waves, maybe would be a better way, the breaking waves. If we don't enter deeply into the breaking waves, then we're always fighting to see the one that frolics in the waves, or frolics in the tides. And the tide is inevitable, right? It's coming and going. It's time.
Thank you.
When you get onto an airplane, they'll tell you in case of emergency to put on your own mask before helping the person next to you.
Yeah.
Which has struck me as kind of good advice in other aspects. And last week, during the Sagaki ceremony, there was a strong emphasis on this vow to help others before helping yourself. I forgot the exact phrase, but I'm really working with this in my life, and like finding myself doing a lot of things for free and struggling with stress around money, and just trying to figure out how to sustain myself and offer freely to the world. So I wonder if you could offer any words about this.
Yeah. To be generous, we have to first be grounded, which is a kind of generosity in our own being. So I think the emphasis in those teachings, those come from a particular set of teachings of Dogen Zenji, the founder of the school, that interestingly were all rewritten. They were like, they took little bits out of all these different places that he wrote, and then it compiled them into a thing that everyone could read. And so the people who are really Dogen purists, they hate those things, because that's not Dogen. That's not what he meant in that sentence. Okay, if that didn't make any sense to you, don't worry about it. It's okay. But for those of you who are Dogen studying people, that makes some difference. In that particular, it's called the Shushogi. In that particular writing, what it's trying to do is talk about a path of practice, and our natural aptitude to try to take care of our own needs and get what we want. This is a kind of direct medicine to that. To say that kind of self-clinging comes to us so naturally that we really need to purposely introduce another way, where we say, maybe I would think about someone else before I think about myself. But actually, I think what you're bringing up here is to be able to think about somebody in a skillful way. You have to have already practiced that grounding, that generosity within your own being, or you won't be able to do it. It's like when you're reaching over really, really, really far to help someone. It's like, okay, first just get your hips closer. Trying to pull dad up off the floor, you got to get your hips underneath you. That's the only way to do it. And so there really is a generosity in making our lives that way, not only helping others. So I think when you feel imbalanced and you feel like, wow, this isn't quite, then that's a place to feel your hips, literally in Zazen, but more like metaphorically, in are your hips underneath you in your life.
We've been talking a little bit about that kind of meeting of tenderness this morning too. Yeah. And after the other thing that happened last week, there's a lot of talk about how we are not listening to each other. Yeah. And that seems to be such a profound difficulty, not just in that big polarized political way, but also just in our own lives, to really put down and hear what each other are saying. I don't know if you could talk about that.
Hallelujah.
That's how we can practice with
Hallelujah,
that.
yeah. I mean, I think that there's a because there's a lot of fear, then fear gives rise to kind of rigidity. And in that rigidity, it's very difficult to hear each other. So I think one of the places that is important for us to look is that fear is not just in our own heart or from my own, like the people I know or the constituencies I agree with, or any of that. There's actually fear that is throughout the whole ecosystem of the United States of America. We talk about it on that level, and oftentimes people will ask, what's the temple's response or what's Buddhism's response to this political issue or that political issue, and usually the answer is there isn't a Buddhist response, and the temple doesn't really go into those places. The reason being is that more what the temple can facilitate is learning to listen more deeply, not only listen to people's opinion, there's that layer, but the more foundational thing, which is to listen for the fear and the pain that is at the basis of that fear. And that's what the Buddha Dharma, the medicine of the Buddha Dharma, is there to unlock. So part of the way we learn to do that is first centering and being available for our own fear and suffering. And a lot of meditation practice, people come into meditation thinking like, I'm going to learn to clean my mind, which is true, but it's kind of, you don't really realize what you're getting into. You don't really realize that what you're being invited into is a direct confrontation with your own fear and suffering, which probably that wouldn't be the flavor you would order if it was if you were there at the ice cream shop. That one, you're probably going to go for something a little different. And so, but it's actually that work, knowing our own fear and our own pain, which allows us to find this deeper conduit of interbeing, which is so buoyant and joyful that then we know, when we can touch that place, then we know, it's worth it. It's worth it. And that, I would say, that buoyancy and joy that is present through that deeper part of our being is what will allow us to not be crushed by meeting the fear and pain of other people. That's a really, if you're not doing that in yourself, and you're trying to listen to that fear and that pain in others, it just becomes more and more overwhelming. So we take up this disciplines. Meditation is one of them, but study, practice, coming together as community, to be able to find that gateway, and then that can happen. So that's kind of the more maybe central function of the temple. Now, having said that, I haven't been a political activist for a long time, but there was a point in my life where that was important to me. And I don't think you can really throw a brick properly without finding that gateway. So, metaphorical or literal. Brick.
What is that?
Mm-hmm.
I live with two very worried teenagers
Yeah.
who just feel utterly betrayed by the world because they didn't even get a say.
Yeah.
And I'm really struggling with how to support them,
Mm-hmm.
besides validating that
Yeah.
they really have been betrayed.
Yeah.
Good up your thoughts.
Yeah. So, in the 2016 election, when Donald Trump won, I was teaching high school, and I was still teaching high school. I did that for a long time. Actually, that was the, let's see. (2016). Yeah, that was the last year I taught high school. And I remember sitting in a circle with all of my students. It was obvious people were upset in different ways, and we spent time talking through it. I was teaching philosophy and religions classes, so it was already a little bit like I didn't have to figure out how to put algebra in, anything like that. It was just we're gonna connect. And one of the things that I found out in those circles was the variety of types of fear and sense of betrayal that different students had. It was really all over the map, everywhere from one of my students who was a trans woman, trans girl, and was like, I'm petrified. Right? To they were sophomores, so it's like you want to call them men or boys or girls or boys. It's like too tricky. A Latino boy or Latino young man who came from a very conservative family, and his family had decided to support Trump. But then he also saw the backside of all the rhetoric against, he was Latino, he was also Mexican, so he's like the kind of conflict that he was feeling inside of himself. One young woman, I just never forget this, is just so deeply impressed in my heart, a young Mormon woman, and she has 2 younger sisters, and she just started crying in the circle, and she said, my family's values align so much with this conservative direction. I can see why there's so much support for Trump in my community, but I cannot look at him, hearing what he said about women, and this was right after the grab him by the language and all that sort of, and she's thinking about her little sisters. And it wasn't exactly about her. It was like, my little sisters, how can I face them, So those are just some examples. The reason I'm saying that is because I think that's where their refuge is too. The betrayal, I think oftentimes is overly conditioned by the adult's idea that something awful has happened. And the political kind of direction that we're driving often overshadows what's actually happening for youth. And so they need that kind of connection to see, like, yeah, I feel betrayed, I feel afraid. There's also other, not only adults, but also youth that feel, and they may feel different than I do. They may be scared for different reasons. They may have other things, but I'd say particularly in Eugene, a thing I really worry about is particularly within certain constituencies is a very idea of a monolithic moral certainty. And our kids are suffering from that bad. They've grown up with this idea that there is a moral certainty, and I am one of the people who knows what it is, and I'm part of the group of people who knows what it is. And so this becomes more devastating for them because of that. And that's, I taught school for a long time. My oldest daughter's a school teacher, and lots of school teacher. That's kind of happening in the schools. That moral certainty of we know exactly the way things are is sort of driven in a particular way. And I'm not blaming teachers for that. I'm just saying there is a kind of gestalt right now in which that political framework is causing I think that's another thing that's causing a lot of pain for the youth. So on a practical level, I would say ease up on moral certainty and lean into listening to these other voices. And then there's going to be a lot of fighting that's going to need to happen. So we got to get our hips on. There's always a lot of fighting that needs to happen. I mean, that didn't start on Tuesday. So I think that it's not. I don't say that those things in exception to the places where there will need to be. How do we work with political power? That's always on the table, but we need to do this work or else we can't get there.
What is on? Carl. So here we are gathered together today.
Yeah.
And if one of our members, I guess we don't have members.
Everyone here's a member of the assembly.
Member of our assembly pulled out this morning a Bluetooth speaker and an amplifier and started saying, we as good Soto Zen Buddhists need to hate Muslims. and the Muslim temple down the street is our enemy. And they brought this speaker into this space, and they started saying these things with anger and vehemence in this space. What would be our responsibility?
To respond. And I think we have something that we're doing, that we have set up, is under the purview of this assembly, and we would shut them down.
This for me is I find this very interesting quality, where for us to make what's happening here work in the way that we care about, there's this very strange thing that there's a quality of something, people may want to call it political, maybe don't have to call it political, but it's a kind of mechanism for how we make communities work.
Yeah.
We can call it democracy. We can call it how we allow ourselves to form as a group and choose as a group how we will behave in that group.
Yeah.
And then how do we hold that and maintain that?
Yeah. And that's, that happens on all kinds of levels. And so we have a certain level that's happening here. And I think the question of what does that mean on larger levels, there's different dynamics in all of those larger levels. I believe that one of the best things we can do for peace, justice, environmental harmony, the many things that we worry about, is to build community. And community is not abstract. This is really, really important. We've given over to a narrative in which my identity makes me part of a particular community. Right? Now, I think identity is important, but when you hear people saying the coffee drinking community, don't you just want to barf? There's no coffee drinking community. There are people who drink coffee. That's not what it is, right? So, but it's kind of made light of, actually, because that's so abstract. It's like this idea that, draw a circle around certain people that you could say are all related in some way, and we'll call it a community. No, community is something that we build. We build it through staying together, working with norms. Actually, a person wouldn't have to bring in a Bluetooth speaker and start playing something that offensive for us to shut them down, because there's a norm within the community about what we're doing together. And that work of adjusting norms, negotiating them, and growing and maturing, that's what communities do. And we've been uprooted from that for a whole bunch of reasons. And I also think that's one of the, for people who are worried about the right-wing political backlash, I'm worried about it. That's something that many of them are very interested in too. Now, their way of negotiating what those norms will be, etc., I don't agree with politically, but to know that people are hungry for that all over. I mean, we're humans. You can't not be, actually, with a few exceptions of people who lives in caves, and then we want to hear what they have to say, but not too much. Yeah.
I think, and I appreciate everything you just said, and I think that is exactly. I mean, it's so important that we can't be good practitioners without recognizing the importance of community and building it.
Yeah.
I guess then, kind of going back to a previous question about, or maybe how you opened the gathering today, about how we deal and process fear, that then we also can recognize how powerful fear is as a political instrument.
Yep.
And then it's like, then when you see groups and or institutions mobilizing it as a technology, as a machine, then again, it's like, do we have to think about responding to those institutions with different institutions, or recognizing that those institutions have to be changed?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, my personal opinion is that power is a thing. Power is a currency, and that it needs to be used very, very wisely. An interesting thing within the Buddhist tradition is that, for the most part, almost completely, the Buddhist tradition has made the decision to not wield power, but for there to be a separation. This is very different than the West, where the divine right of kings was kind of this central European mindset where God's coronation of the center of the kingdom, etc., that doesn't really exist in Buddhism. So Buddhism was always saddled up against power, but saying that Buddhism itself will work to help clarify what is the skillful way, but won't be the wielder of power. Now, in some ways, I think there's some drawbacks to that. But I'd say it also has served the tradition well, to say that really our role within the Buddhist tradition is to learn what is that deep touching, and then the machines that we make to wield power, we have a different kind of driver than just the thirst for power, and that's why I think sometimes I would say from this pulpit, Trump is an awful human being, from all ways, all of the things I can see. And the thing that is the most particularly awful to me is the way in which he vilifies the weak to gain power. And that's something that if you do these practices of knowing fear and knowing pain deeply, that will become increasingly repugnant to you. Right? So we can talk about that. That's not even talking about politics. That's just talking about repugnancy of moral character, which we talk about a lot. And so I think that those lines are very interesting. But we do need institution. There's always that power. I think the other message from Buddhism is everything's changing. And so, of course, people have been fighting for these things for a long time, and the fight will continue. Actually, we shouldn't find our place of rest in having arrived. That's very core Buddhist teaching. There's no arriving. There's just keep going. And every once in a while we get to arrive in a place we get to breathe easy a little bit and maybe eat some bananas and swim in the this is from a famous sutra called the Lotus Sutra, where a city appears and all of the travelers are there just able to enjoy some rest. And it's a phantom city. And then at one point the city disappears and then there's just this long road. And it's a teaching about, there's different ways to interpret it, but the way I interpret it is that the Buddha says, of course, if you're practicing sincerely, there will be the quality of rest and ease and arrival, but don't ever think that is a permanent place. Whatever arrival is about is always about the road, and we've got to do both at the same time.
I have a very special student at the university, and they have had a very hard year, loss of a very close friend, and I remember at that time sitting with them and just seeing the pain that they were in. And, on Wednesday, they were in the classroom early, and I arrived, and they were in exactly the same posture and position. I recognized this right away. And I talked to them a little bit, and they're a trans youth, and I realized that what I was seeing was unprocessed grief. It was not like complicated. That they had grief, that they did not know what they were supposed to do with it. And I had all of these things I wanted to say to them, very idealistic, and all of these resources I wanted to point them towards the university. But all of this just sort of fell apart in me, that there's so much desire to move towards action, to do something that is going to make a tangible difference outwardly, and I want to do that for this person, I want to help them be able to do that, but the grief is not processed yet. Can you share a little bit of your experience with working specifically with people in grief, and how we can share that kind of work as a community?
So there are different levels in which grief might be worked with. People might work with a therapist or a grief counselor or something like that. So I don't know about that. I mean, I know there's stuff in that's good. But I would say on the just more kind of very direct level, give up explanation. When I was hitting the hardest grief of my life, when I heard people say stages of grief, I wanted to rip their face off. Really. I mean, I would just say, don't put this in a box so that you can feel more comfortable that I might not survive this. It's about you. You want to put it in a box so that can happen. I'm just talking for myself. I know sometimes getting things in boxes and lining them up is helpful for processing. But if you bring that to somebody who's in grief, you're inviting them to not feel wholly what is present for them at that place. And that's where people get stopped, right? They're thinking like, oh, there's going to be a process. When's this going to be over? I could do this and this and this and this. All are ways to not actually do the grieving that's necessary. So, that was a lot of learning for me, being a kind of explainer, that, really seeing like how, not just how unuseful it is, but really harmful it can be. Again, that doesn't mean we don't give resources, encourage people to do these things or whatever, but that should all be on top of your own grief, being as directly close to their grief as possible. And a lot of times that's not saying anything. That's just knowing your own grief in a way that you can be present with grief in a way that people know that you're not trying to get it in a box or fix it or do whatever kind of thing, whatever kind of manipulation there. It's like, so it was like this, when our daughter died, I realized a lot of people lost children. I didn't know, I walked around in a world where I didn't know that. I mean, I knew it, but I didn't know it. And then all of a sudden, like in an assembly like this would be like, oh, there's 10 people, 12 people. And then it was like this thing opened up. And so when you can meet from that place, like, oh my gosh, we really all share a very, very profound and fundamental grief. That's the place where I think the Buddhist practice really is asking us. Again, all these other places that help people work with that, I think they have their place, they're important, but this is something that we can really do through Buddhist practices to mine our own, mine isn't quite the right word, open up the shuttered parts of our own grief. And then people know it. If you're talking with somebody who's there with that, you know it like that. And then if you're like, hey, maybe, what do you think about going to some counseling? That could be a piece of this. That's totally different than I meet you, I don't know what to do with your grief. Hey, let me see if I can get you into some counseling, right? So I think that's really the skillful way to work with it. And sometimes you don't have the time to really saddle up, like just get really close, but we can make the time, we can prioritize it. And then also, oftentimes, I find it's not exactly about time. It's just more about, it's like a simple kind of caring.
Mm-hmm. This is also a grief question. I was talking to a student of mine who lives in a very red state, and this was this morning, and she was in tears, and she was talking about, she's a Christian, she was talking about all the churches around her celebrating. And that brought up for her own traumatic schism with the church. And I feel like there's this religious grief that I'm carrying about a way in which the sacred is held, and my own kind of increasing, I'm a interfaith chaplain who was a born-again Christian in my youth, and I'm finding myself like, ooh, Christians, which is super weird and painful, and has been in the air for a while. But it's sort of like God has been co-opted. I mean, it's not sort of, it is. I feel like there's a way in which being a Buddhist, being clergy, being like, I'm not even sure what my question is, but it's like I want to be part of holding the sacred in this time in a way that isn't in the pits of power.
Yeah. So this is the sacred is ungraspable, unmanipulatable. We can't dominate it. We can't do anything. And so in those veins, it doesn't have to do with power. And so from that place, of course, there will be all kinds of hooligans that run through those sacred halls and do all manner of obscene things, not recognizing the preciousness of that luminous reality. I mean, that's what we're all doing all the time, right? We're in those halls constantly, and yet we, we're just kind of taking a crap everywhere. Yeah. Right? And so I think that's the starting place, is to see that. And then what do we cultivate in terms of our respect for the sacred? Are we the clowns? We got to go around and do a little sweep up. That might be part of it. But it might also be challenging and saying, like, how could you celebrate this? And so a kind of challenge to the beings that we see are running, roughshod in that arena, I think is also appropriate. Oftentimes we're not quite brave enough for that. And I don't mean not brave enough that we're not willing to put up a Facebook post about how stupid they are or whatever. Like, that's not the bravery I'm talking about. I mean, like, actually braver, like the bravery of having our own position revealed. Like, no, that's wrong. What do you mean wrong? Like, now we're exposed, right? And that bravery to say, like, no, that's not right. And and it gets tricky between Buddhism and Christianity because of this God or no God sort of situation. I mean, in Buddhism, yeah, God's a jerk. God's Mara. God's the one that keeps all this stuff going all the time, right? So it's a little like, but when we're trying to be interfaith, we don't. Just,
I don't say that in the hospital.
But yeah. What did you expect? Yeah. I mean, just to clarify on that, when I say God in this sense within Buddhism, it means the supreme deity of this particular world, which sees that the wheel of life and death keeps spinning. That's the sole purpose of this, kind of the top of the gods of this world. And so could be very flattering, I'm sure, if Mara wanted to be. But keeps those wheels of karma going. So it's in some ways very different than the God we think about in a Christian context, for example, a transcendent God that is all powerful but also all good, all of those kinds of things, which is another whole theology. I would say just another thing that I think we really need to do is I think that for those of you who are inclined philosophically or theologically, is we need to know our own teachings more deeply, and we need to know the teachings of other faiths more completely. And I think that's one of the places that we really mess up. I was sharing with the breakfast crew this morning that yesterday I listened to this fantastic conversation between two feminist Catholics. Super cool. They're super conservative. Yeah. And one of the things they said was they were talking about when they converted to Catholicism, the first time they went into a church, part of what drew them to Catholicism is when they went into the church, they said, we grew up in Christian environments where female bodies were completely absent. And we walked into a church where there's female embodiment everywhere. And that the materiality, the fleshiness of being is celebrated. And it was really interesting to hear them talk all about that. Now, when we got to the level of politics, which isn't what they were talking about, probably a lot of disagreements. But there's a whole bunch that was inside of what they were saying that was different. Of course, the people who bring in the Bluetooth speaker and go, rah, 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 of course they're dweebs. I mean, it's like that. Like, you're not expecting depth and like insight from that compulsion to kind of to just speaker your whatever out there. And so those I mostly don't really. Let's go someplace else. But then you can get overly intellectual, and that's not so helpful.
Mm-hmm. I'm struck by the apparent assumption in the assembly today that everyone in here agrees. And I grapple with this because I live in the same bubble, apparently all of us do. But I wonder if anybody who had voted the other way, how they would feel in here right now. I'm struggling with I have very few people in my life. I mean, I really am totally in a bubble, okay? I have very few people in my life who actually don't agree with me. They're so smart, you know? And I'm trying to get over my delusions that are inexhaustible, okay? I try to climb over my own stuff to be able to understand where they're coming from. And I don't know, this assumption of agreement is disconcerting for me, because we're not open here. We're not apparently opening ourselves here to somebody who genuinely, honestly, using many of the same values that we cherish, just has drawn a different conclusion. So I don't know, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that, so I work hard to listen to all kinds of opinions. And I think that's all of our work. It's also, there will be, for the purposes of being able to discuss and communicate, our leanings will be evident in that. Our leanings in terms of our opinions about things. So when I speak from this seat, I always try to contextualize that really, really clearly. And so that we don't confuse our personal perspective on the politics of it and this deeper necessity to not think that we're right and other people are wrong. So I guess what I'm saying here is I think that contextualization is enough. I think that's actually what we can do. If we don't speak about how we're generally perceiving things, then we won't be able to really come together as an assembly. So anyone here could say, "Hey, I voted for Trump,"
I know.
or someone could say, "I think there's a real problem with immigration and we need to do something about it." All of those kinds of particulars, I imagine, actively took up the particulars. You might be quite surprised what my opinion would be on many of those things, even though I'm speaking in a kind of very generalized idea about the difficulty that people are facing in the election. So
Lee would like her mom. I'm not sure what she is. Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. So my point in that is just to say that our main function here is not to make the platform for a kind of like spectrum of political anything, but to talk more about what's underneath it. And from everything that people have said today so far, what I'm hearing is a kind of fear about a Trump presidency.
Right, this is not a comment on your approach.
Yeah.
It's a comment on the assembly itself, in that I don't know, would anyone here feel comfortable after this amount of time to get up and say, I have deep reservations about, you know, the immigration thing, or, you know,
Well, let me make my point a little bit clear here. No one in the assembly has talked about specific, has said, I feel this way about immigration, or I feel this way about that. People are only talking about what is the fear or what is the grief that is coming about through this process. And so I think that's a place where if someone wanted to get up and start saying, well, you know, this is my political opinion about da 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 da, then that's not exactly what we're doing here.
okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And so the assembly's job right now is not to have a political opinion. And preparing for today, to tell you the truth, I had to spend some time really, because I'm a very politically opinionated person, and I have very strong opinions, and right now most of my anger is not at Trump, it's at the Democrats. And so I had to realize, like, I could go there and I'll open my mouth, and 2 hours later everyone will be gone and I'll be screaming out my head, and that's where we'll be left. And so I was really doing some work to kind of like corral my own political like fire about what it is. Of course, you know, I have my own political thoughts about things, but that's not exactly what we're doing in the assembly. But I agree with you, it's very tricky, and particularly in this bubble of Eugene, Oregon, the where we snap to grid about moral certainty, and I better say it this way because that's the way that I think everyone thinks that I would. It's rampant here in a way that is much like what we despise in a kind of right-wing environment. Now, that I think is really, really important for us all to think about.
And that's the place.
Yeah. Let me tell everyone a story here. One of our Sangha members went to Wisconsin with the Democratic Party to help work in the polls. And so that's one thing that is a ground game in political elections. You have people at every polling station, particularly in the environment of this past week, and you're helping people vote. And she said this really interesting thing. She came back, we were able to talk about it a little bit. She said, you know, at the polling station I was at in Wisconsin, we were exactly half and half. Exactly half voted for Trump and half voted for Kamala Harris. And she said, I spent all day there from like 6:30 in the morning till 8 at night or whatever it was. And she said, I saw all those people came in. I helped some people when they came in, and they needed help with something, et cetera. And she said, I couldn't tell you who was who. It wasn't like all the people coming in were one way or the other way. And I thought that was very insightful. That she said, she said it was a real big, like, visceral experience for her to be in that situation and realize all of these people you couldn't say one way or the other. And I think that could be a guiding principle for us. Uh-huh.
Question. I'm wondering if you could talk about self-compassion when you feel you've made a mistake.
Yeah. So, kind of two directions that this can tend to go in. Other directions too, but two that are strong. One is a deep desire to get off the hook, right? And the other one's a deep desire to just be killed by the hook, which is really another way of getting off the hook, right? So they're kind of motivated in a similar way, but they have a kind of opposite reaction to themselves. And so getting off the hook in the first way may look like a lot of apologizing, recognizing, being with, self-flagellation maybe, it could be a lot of different things, but when it's motivated in this deeper sense about kind of like, if I do enough of this, I will be forgiven by myself, by others, etc., that it can't ever quite go there, right? Because the essential motivation is off of it. And then the other one is just the opposite. Like if I could just be bad, right? If I could just be pierced by this thing and say, okay, I'm horrible, then that would solve the problem. I wouldn't have to think about it anymore. Right? I don't recommend the second one at all. The first one is better. It's more wholesome, right? But where the work then is to see what's at the bottom of the motivation while you're staying present with it. And to be really present with the karma of having made that mistake is where the undoing can happen. But we can't force it. We can't undo it. We have to pay enough attention to it that the undoing can happen. But it's really tricky because while we're there, we're almost certainly, how do I get off the hook? How do I get off the hook? How do I get off the hook? And that's the place to watch for. And part of the Buddha's teaching in that is, look, you made a mistake, welcome to the club. And when it's a really hard mistake, that doesn't really solve, it doesn't have so much levity. But it really is like, we're marked by that. That's what karma is, particularly negative karma. And so when we've made that mistake, now we have a chance that we didn't have before because we couldn't see it. And the mistake didn't just happen. These things aren't, generally speaking, random. There's some piece of it which is karmic. And that's the part that we mostly want to either kill or get away from. And so that's where we need to let it teach us. But it can be covered by a lot of other stuff that is sort of red herring, So getting down to that can be tough. But the meditation, the meditation practice is particularly helpful in that if we're not just trying to clear everything out, but kind of clear out all of those stories so that we could be present with the deeper thing. And it's no fun. Okay, one last one, and then we'll go. I think, Joanne, did you have? Mm-hmm.
This is relevant to what we've been talking about, but it's also deeply, I'm at a big turning point in my life with this question. It's relevant everywhere. This line, I've heard glimmers of it in your responses, so if you'll be a little more, this line between a practice of deep listening of other people and where they're coming from, a practice of cultivating trust, cultivating connection that's below our opinions, and how that feels in my just day-to-day practical life when I stop conceptualizing it, actually very dichotomized against standing by words, against standing by your opinion, against feeling the truth of what you believe. And I find that, now especially, that those two things are so at odds in my heart. How does that line work in your world?
So the purpose for listening, what's deep, talk about this deeper place or the place where we're not dichotomized in our opinions. The purpose for that is not to roll over. The purpose for that is so that we can meet the situation truly. And meeting the situation truly requires the integrity of our own conviction. And so what we don't want to do, this is a really good question, what we don't want to do in that listening for the deeper thing is lose our conviction. Our conviction will become stronger, which will also include more nuance, which is tricky politically because politics is oftentimes not super nuanced. The way you get votes is to just say something and keep saying it even though it's not true. Weapons of mass destruction. Did you guys know they never found weapons of mass destruction? You're not among the 80% of the population that believes that they were found, by the way. So, sorry. But that's how politics functions, right? And so you can see, like, from a political strategy standpoint, what are people going to do? They're going to do that. But you're not a politician. If you were, you would need to think about that. But you don't. What you need to do is you need to allow your conviction to become round and complete. And the only way it's going to ground is if it's not based on you trying to find some scrap of ground and make sure it's still and true and stable and stand there and then throw stuff at other people from that place. That's the weakest possible position. You'll be blown over like in a moment. What you want to do is to be able to move. You want to be able to relax. You want to be able to touch something, and when you touch it, you know, like, ooh, this thing's weak, it's rigid. This person's afraid. They've got some big idea about how, you know, this group of people is going to screw up the whole country or whatever, and you're just like, what are you afraid of? You know, like, that's where I would say the real power comes from, and then your words can carry conviction because they're not based in trying to protect some little scrap of ground that you've, you know, decided is kind of the right spot, or you know, some group of people has, and you said, well, I guess, yeah, it seems pretty good to me. But now you become an active participant in the waves, and in that place, now you've got a voice which is really something much different than either blown over or just trying to, you know, stand your ground. Because here now your ground has to do with where are you standing, not this is the only place I can stand. And as you like, you touch something, you put your foot down. Like, you ever try to do this. This is kind of good exercise to study this, like, with your body. Try to walk across with like really stiff legs. Just like walk across the ground. That's what we're doing all the time. You know, we got these big clunky shoes on, and we're like that. But if you take your shoes off, or you didn't have to take your shoes off, and then you're just like, what's it like to put your foot down and actually feel how gravity brings you to touching the ground? My Tai Chi teacher, I think he's like 87, and so scary. Only in very little tiny glimmers. But that's how he walks. Everything's like that, right? So immense power, you know, in a martial sense. But that comes from this kind of internal work, which is soft. And that's the kind of thing that you're looking for. I would say on a practical level, I'm trying to get back to the practical stuff today, get in some hairy fights.
You got it.
Yeah. But in those hairy the reason I say hairy fights is because if you really get into hairy fights, it will expose your own position. The place where you're grabbing on to this piece of ground. You're like, no, but this is true. How do you know it's true? Because it's true. It's true. That's why it's true. You know, like those places will be revealed in that process. And you know, it has to be a safe enough environment that you feel like you can get in that kind of hairy fight, which is a little problem in the current bubble. But yeah, good luck. Yeah.